Susie wanted me to apply to a Florida law school. And I told her if I went to a Florida law school, I might have to build my career in Florida. And as it turned out, she knew where I was going before I did.
Okay.
But we ended up in Bradenton, Florida, where she was raised, and we've never looked back.
Very nice. Yeah. What year did you get down here then?
Graduated in 1976.
Okay.
So that's when I passed the bar and joined the firm that's now called Blalock Walters.
Okay. And what was it called then? Just Blalock?
No, it was Knowles, Blalock, Coleman, and Landers.
Okay.
So I joined four men that allowed me to join their ranks. I'm probably one of the few lawyers in the country that started with a firm, and 50 years, close to 50 years later, I'm still there.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. So I didn't realize there were actually four attorneys in Bradenton back in the mid 70s. I wouldn't have guessed there were so many.
There were a few.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. So you've been with Blalock Walters for almost 50 years. You've been, how did it come about that you got connected with Bealls initially?
What happened is that Egbert Bell, your grandfather, and Bob Blalock, my senior partner, took a trip to Pittsburgh to watch the Pittsburgh Pirates play.
Okay.
And while they were there, they commiserated that they both had to suffer the challenges of young people in their organization that thought they were smart, that had a lot to prove, that had a lot of ideas. So Egbert Bell decided to have his son, Bob, meet with Bob's nemesis, me, and said, why don't you all take over the leasing function of the company and see if you can come up with a way to deal with leases, how we deal with landlords, and put that energy to work.
Okay.
So your dad and I started out in that manner, and we had a ball doing it. We learned a lot. And it was a great journey that we started at that point in time. I'm very grateful to both Bob Blalock and Egbert Bell for allowing the two of us who really did think we were smarter than we were to get together and beat our heads against the pretty tough landlords that were at that time leasing shopping centers throughout the state.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. So that was so you obviously impressed E.R. Bell. I mean, so that was kind of, was he the one that asked you to come onto the board originally?
What happened originally is your dad wanted to create a full board of directors. ER wasn't totally on board, but at that point, Bob was president, and Bob was astute enough. Bob had a unique skill at looking not just next year or the following year, but years down the road. And he was concerned with governance, what would happen when Egbert was gone, and how he would be able to sustain the confidence of the family. So he conceived of the idea with Egbert of creating this board, which was at that time Egbert and Bob, and they added Betty Szymanski, Egbert's sister. And then they asked Harold Whitcomb, who was a retired CPA that had worked with the company, and myself to join the board to see if we could get it going, how it would operate. A lot of good reasons for that. Lenders had more confidence in the company knowing that there was a board involved. The factors that were so important to vendors like to know that. Bob started an annual report that maybe built us up a little bigger than we were. And Egbert became very comfortable with that. And I think he enjoyed creating a formal way to communicate with his sister and make sure that the Szymanski side of the family understood the company, how important it was. And we talked about shared values at that point in time, about not getting ahead of ourselves. So,
did you work with RM, the founder of Bealls, at any point in time? I think he passed away in the early 80s, maybe.
I did work with RM, but not as a legal counselor per se. My main involvement with RM, he was an icon of the community. You simply can't understand it today because there was no one like him today that was like him then. He created so many initiatives that we're the beneficiaries of today. He saved baseball for Manatee County. He was the force behind building McKechnie Field that's now Lecom Field. He created the Bradenton Trailer Park that later became the Kiwanis Trailer Park, that later was sold and created the foundation that the Kiwanis Club of Bradenton utilizes. He started the Boys and Girls Club of Manatee County with others. Whenever something needed to be done, he was a quiet man, but when he asked people to come together, he was able to bring them together and helped elevate the community. So I got to know him when he was working in the downtown store that's now the county administration building. But you would go in there, he would greet you at the door. He want to know, you want to buy a pair of pants? Very gracious, soft-spoken. And then I would go to Kiwanis, and the seas would part. When he came in, everybody wanted to sit with him. He was just an icon of the community and was just revered.
That's really
I
cool.
was privileged to get to know him in his final years.
Yeah. And how would you describe his personality? What was it about him that made him such a pioneer?
When I got to know him, everyone knew he was absolutely trustworthy. Mm-hmm. They knew if he told you something that you could take it to the bank. And they knew he had accomplished so much for the community. He received many awards. Probably you don't even have them because he really didn't do anything to be recognized. His ego was like not on the table, but he was so powerful with his presence because of who he was and how important he was to the community. You know, he created jobs. He lost the business. The bank kept him on running the business until he bought it back. He always thought of others, even when he and his family were not sure where the next meal, I guess, was coming from. And you look at his two children, Betty Szymanski and Egbert Bell, and boy, they were two icons of the community. So he was just a special person.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, when you think about when you go back to that time period, it's difficult to imagine how different the county would have been than it was today. You know, but he was certainly responsible for bringing a lot of business here, a lot of people here, a lot of snowbirds here. You know, just a lot of traffic down to this area. I think at this point, a lot of people are like, okay, that's enough. let's widen the roads. Let's stop.
He overachieved.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Well, that's really cool. That's really cool. Yeah, special guy. I think he passed away when I was maybe 2 or 3 years old or something like that. So I didn't ever get to know my great-grandfather, but his son ER, as you mentioned, took over for the family business for RM, the first when he passed. And how would you describe ER? How would he contrast with RM as a leader and as a person?
Well, unlike RM Bell, ER scared me a bit.
All right.
Not because he was scary, but because he was so smart, so many steps ahead of you, that you wanted to make sure when you engaged with him, you absolutely knew the topic, you knew what you were going to communicate. If there was a problem, you had a solution, or you gave him the 2 or 3 options, and that you didn't embellish or overtalk. You had to be on your game. Egbert Bell was always the most pleasant. He was just nice. You always felt like, isn't he a wonderful, nice person? But every interaction with him, from my perspective, I was trying to do legal work for the company, and I wanted to impress him, but I knew if I overdid it, it would not impress him at all. I just had to be real with him. He really prized authenticity. False flattery would be an absolute wrong way to go with him. But he would and did make hard decisions. He was not afraid of a hard decision. He had strong beliefs in how the company should be run. He expected his people to perform. But he didn't personalize matters. But it was absolutely clear what we did and how we did it had to be in the best interest of the company.
We have more humble beginnings than most people would probably have realized had they not, kind of known the history. And you mentioned my great-grandfather, RM, having to buy the company back from the bank back in the 30s. And of course, that was when the Great Depression came through, and very, very difficult times for everybody, certainly for Bealls. Can you talk a little bit about how some of the humble beginnings, some of how it was, what was it like for the company, from your understanding back when my great grandfather and grandfather were operating the business? How does it differ from today?
The Depression made an indelible impact upon both Bob Bell and the R.M. Bell and Egbert Bell. Losing the company to the bank was beyond traumatic. Everything that had been worked for over a decade was now lost. The bank, I believe it was the Manatee River Bank at that time, what were they going to do with a failed department store? So they allowed R.M. Bell to continue to operate it. It took several years to operate it, and then eventually R.M. Bell was able to save enough and make enough money to buy the store back and acquire its ownership. But boy, what a struggle they had to go through during the Depression when all families were being challenged. Well, think about that man who lost his store, who's worried about feeding his family. How is he going to get his children educated? And he's still out in the community helping those that are even worse off elevate. Mm-hmm. It is quite a litany of character, of commitment, and engagement with this community. So we look at that, and there was a tremendous aversion to debt. And anytime that Bob Bell, your dad, he wanted to push the company to a different plane. He wanted to elevate. But to do that, often debt is necessary to achieve it. And Egbert would remind Bob, and sometimes I was in those meetings, that we don't want to get too far ahead. Mm-hmm. And there is one time when we did, and that was when Bob went out and negotiated 6 leases to open 6 new stores. Now, this is when we had, I'm not sure, 24 stores. Mm-hmm. So we were adding 25% mm-hmm. to the entire portfolio, mm-hmm. except Bob told his dad, I was there. Well, Dad, only half of these are likely to come to fruition. We don't need to worry about it. A year later, they all looked like they were coming to fruition. And a year after that, every one of them came online within maybe a 6-month period. Oh. We had to order inventory. Where was the working capital coming from to support 6 new stores, to build them out? We were in a challenged circumstance that actually led to this DC being built on the corporate campus and the corporate headquarters. Okay. But it was a challenging time for Bob, who had to look at his dad every day and explain where cash flow was and how we were paying the bank back and those things.
This was early 80s?
This was the early mid-80s.
Okay. So was this during that peak inflation period, or was this just past that?
Yes, that was real inflation. Yeah. If you think we've been in inflation now, those days were abysmally difficult with inflation. Right. Though it actually helped the company a bit in the standpoint leases became less expensive. Right. Merchandise you had procured, you could sustain a higher gross margin as the cost of goods went up. In some ways, inflation was helpful to us in navigating those difficult times. Mm-hmm. Another time that occurs to me was we created a chain called Just Labels. The Just Labels chain turned out not to make money. And relative to the rest of the company, it was a considerable drain on cash profitability. And we were desperate to figure out what to do with this. We weren't sorry we did it, because if you're not constantly testing concepts, challenging your consumer, then you're just doing the same old thing and you will eventually regress. But we had to do something with it. And Egbert and Bob and a few others in the company came up with a unique concept called Bealls Outlet. And by golly, we went to glory on that one. So that was exciting to see that manifest itself. And a number of your forefathers, Paul Galizia, came in and really elevated that chain. It was a wonderful journey to see that work out.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. So that would have been mid '80s probably. That would have been one of the first big undertakings for the company with your time on the board, right? The conversion of just labels to Bealls Outlet.
That was, but we also had other wonderful experiences like the department store business. When I started, when I started working with Bealls, the stores we had were called junior department stores. And we were considered inferior to a real department store.
Okay.
And our biggest competitor included J. Byron's and others. And we were always the last one picked. If no one else wanted it, we would be allowed to go in. Well, as it evolved and as we improved, as our merchandising became enhanced, your dad began to put a team together where we not only rivaled others, we became preferred. And at that point, we were able to navigate deals that we were not otherwise able to achieve. One that I remember vividly was J. Byron's went out of business, and we picked up a number of their locations. We were able to cherry pick them, which enabled us to go in, not have to make all the improvements you normally would in great locations because they were in markets we knew we could be successful. And you could take 6 stores at one time.
Yeah, that's been a strategy that's worked for us for a number of years on a number of different occasions. J. Byron's back in the '80s. We've got.
Well, I know a grandson of Egbert Bell that had managed to achieve that during the pandemic.
Right. Yeah, Stage more recently, yes. For sure. Yeah, that was a big one. 150 stores, and then Goodies in Conrad's day.
Conrad went to town on Goodies. It was a feeding frenzy.
It was.
But it's not as easy as it looks. That was a lesson I learned from Egbert Bell. 10% is inspiration. 90% is perspiration. You have to execute, you have to get the job done.
Yep, absolutely. What was the department store business like at that time? Because the department stores really started to take off in the 1990s for us, really probably under Conrad's leadership, mostly in the 1990s and then into the early 2000s up till 2006 or so. What was it like at that time period leading up to that big boom of the department stores in the state of Florida?
The company was continually trying to refine its product mix. What did the consumers want? What was the ideal size of the stores? How do we position the stores effectively in a market to maximize our offerings? And the stores earlier than that were typically in the 35,000 square foot arena. And your dad wanted to expand that to 40,000, 35 to 40, even 45,000. And to do that, you needed a different product mix. You needed more inventory. We needed to be perhaps in different markets. And so there was a constant process of experimentation as different methods and markets were being addressed. We tried to go in different places that weren't as successful as others. But in order to grow, we couldn't just be in Bradenton, Sarasota, Venice. We had to work to get into other places. The other thing I noticed, your grandfather, Egbert, I won't say it was every week, but frequently played golf with Joe Blanton of Publix, Jack Eckerd of the Eckerd drugstore chain, and John Crowder, who ran a hardware
Crowder
chain,
Brothers.
Crowder Brothers. And he was constantly learning about what others were doing, other retailers.
They were all here locally then?
Joe Blanton was Publix, so he was in Lakeland, and Jack Eckerd, I believe, was in Pinellas County.
Pinellas, okay, right.
So they would travel around the state and play golf courses. Okay. And by the way, that's how they opened Bealls. Joe Blanton would say, Publix is going to open a shopping center in Spring Hill I'm just making this up, and would you like to have a Bealls in there? Sometimes Publix owned the shopping center. Sometimes they had a developer they were working with. And Jack Eckerd would typically say, I'm in. John Crowder was more problematic. He had to check it out. And Egbert would often say, we're going to do it. Sometimes he would come back and Bob would scramble to get it together. And interestingly, as Egbert began to turn more and more of the operational activity over to Bob, and Joe Blanton evolved at Publix, we would get a call from Publix saying, with regard to your location in, we never got around to getting a lease done. We were open and operating in shopping centers throughout the state without a written lease that were done with Publix, where the Publix owned the center, and we had to retroactively create the leases. And that was extraordinarily interesting to me to see that. And then your dad was going around the state making deals. Do you have a memory of that, Matt, of your dad's activity?
I was collecting baseball cards for the most part back then. I was just thinking about what I was doing in the mid 80s into the late 80s. And, my dad didn't really talk too much about business when he got home. So by the time he got home, he was really ready to relax and just kind of take his mind off of work. And so I didn't really have a good grasp of what was going on in the business probably until, till high school, college, when I started to work at the company. So yeah, I was, so not really.
Well, that's about the time Conrad was asked to elevate into Bealls department store and provide leadership. And prior to that, he was doing the leases. And Conrad is an extraordinarily capable executive. And he would see opportunities to maximize what the company was doing and was chomping at the bit, I believe, to have the opportunity to evolve the department store into more of a powerhouse. And when he took over as president of Bealls Department Stores, things really began to change for the department store. The offerings became more elevated, deeper. Inventory management became more critical. And I think probably some of the shortcomings of our logistics began to manifest themselves that required us to address logistical issues more robustly. It's a constant challenge to operate a retailer, particularly as it's growing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Conrad did some amazing things with the company at that point in the department store world. It was pilot high and let it fly, and he was a master with that for sure, and had some incredible years with the company. Now those stores are quite large for what we would prefer them to be today. A lot of those stores that we have on the what formerly known as Bealls Department Stores, now known as Bealls Florida, are in the 80,000 square feet, some bigger, and we're really looking to now. It's funny how things change. We're looking to now kind of downsize those and get them into something that's a little bit more modern for today's retail world. So yeah, it's interesting. What were some of the big learnings that you had from each of the leaders? Like if you were to say, a huge takeaway that you had from RM or ER or Bob or Conrad, what did each of those guys what did you take away from your time working with them?
With ER, you knew what he wanted. He would let you set your agenda. If he approved it, he would support you 100%, but he would be quick to pull the plug on you if you weren't achieving what you said you could achieve. He was not hesitant to make a decision. He was clear-eyed in who was performing and who wasn't. When Alan Butler had the license with the company to sell shoes, he was extraordinarily excited one day to point out to Egbert Bell how many people were in the store buying shoes on his BOGO platform, buy one, get one. And Egbert watched it for a minute and turned to Alan, said, "Alan, any fool can give it away." And Alan Butler says to this day, it was a huge lesson that if you're going to survive in retail, you have to sustain margin.
Right.
And a BOGO is not necessarily the best way to do it.
Right.
So I loved Egbert Bell for his quickness. Another time we were in a board meeting, and at that point the board had evolved to some really smart people. We had Betty Everard from New York. We had Jack Painter, who was the head of the ad agency that, for example, represented Publix. We had Steve Westerfield, who had been the CEO of several retailers. And the topic was whether we should enhance advertising in September. Now, this topic was banded around for 20 minutes. I have no idea why, but it was. And it finally got around. Your dad, who was chairing the meeting, said, "Now, Dad, what do you think?" And Egbert, having listened to this for 20 minutes, said, "You don't shoot if the ducks aren't flying." Meaning there's no one here in Florida buying in September. It totally killed the debate. We didn't enhance the advertising budget for September. And I just thought it was brilliant. And I was glad I didn't weigh in on my thoughts, because he wouldn't have appreciated the thoughts of an attorney on a marketing initiative on marketing.
Right.
Your dad had a enhanced focus on leadership. He worked really hard to bring in smart, capable executives, and he worked hard with them to make sure they understood his expectations, and he worked hard to make sure they had the resources, but he also made sure they were accountable on a more formalistic basis. And by formalistic, I mean Egbert was more of a walk around, see how things were going. Bob was very intent on reports. He wanted real numbers. He wanted to make his decisions based upon factual information. He didn't want to listen to BS. And if a hard decision wanted to be made, he wanted the executive to make it within his or her division or department. But Bob's quiet leadership was manifest. His integrity was absolute. And I will share an example that impacted me, where I was doing the leases, right? And we had a lease where after the lease was signed, the minimum rent was increased, but the percentage rent on breakpoint, I know that's a complex topic, but basically you pay a percentage rent over a certain gross sales amount, wasn't increased as it should have been. And the lease went on, and 5 years later, we hit the break point and was way too low. And Bob called me upset. He said, "How did we do this? We have a lease with the wrong break point." And it was costing the company real money. And so I called the landlord, and they said, "Well, we've already pledged the lease to the bank. We can't change it. You're out of luck." So I'm just horrified. I'm embarrassed. I don't know how this happened. I went back to Bob. I came up with a strategy on how we were going to deal with it, worked with the landlord, and we resolved it to our mutual satisfaction. It was at that point I noticed that I was not the one that drafted the lease amendment that should have included an increase in breakpoint.
You would have done it right.
I'd like to think I would have done it right. I guarantee you I'd do it right today. Yeah. Bob had done it himself. But my point of this story is during that 2-month process, Bob never came to me and said, "How did you make this mistake? You're no longer our attorney. I expect you to pay for all of our lost rent." He never said that at all. His whole focus was, how do we solve the problem? Now, I knew if we kept having these problems, I'd be hitting the road. But his support of me, when he didn't know that I hadn't made the mistake, tripled my loyalty to the company, to know that I have to do everything I can to support him and the company in achieving their results, because this is who I want to be with. My dad always told me, "Son, as you go through life, the people you hang with define you, they become you, and if you hang around with good people, they will elevate you, and if you hang around with the wrong crowd, you will eventually fall to their level." So being able to be with Bob and people in this company that have that integrity has been a blessing to me, and I think it's been a blessing for those that have worked within the company. Bob has made some hard decisions that have negatively impacted people, and the majority of those people still love Bob Beall. Even later, they thank him for firing them. "Yep, you should have fired me." Yeah. Now, they're not always so happy with me when I had to work out their arrangements, but Bob, they knew he was not coming at it as a matter of personality. He was coming at it because it was the right decision.
Good. Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of one of our values that we have today. We've got 7 values that we've launched, and accountability is kind of that value. That's what speaks to that. And it's a different type of accountability than most people think about, but what it is accountability for your mental state. And so for him never to go and lose it on you, is kind of what that value is all about. It's about no blame and no victim. It's that I'm not a victim and there's no one to blame. And once you realize that, then you can kind of have a better control of your mental state. And so that's something that we're trying to be conscientious of today in the business, just to create a more positive, less. It's a stressful business, so there can be times where people say things that they don't want to regret. So yeah, accountability is a big one for us.
What else have I suggested in the history that I know of the company that has been reflected in these values that are being expressed?
Yeah, I think compassion, it seems like it's one that's been woven throughout. So, when you think about these words, you got to think about the opposite of the word to really understand what the word means. And compassion, it's kind of I'd say hatred's probably a strong word as an opposite, but dislike, dissatisfaction, disapproval, all the disses, all that kind of negativity. And so having compassion for people, you mentioned my dad might have to terminate some people from time to time, but it wasn't something that he enjoyed doing. I know that, it's not a fun thing to do. It's not something that you do out of spite, or it's not something that you do and that you take lightly when you do. It's something that if it has to be done, you really kind of have to think about it as, hey, this is the best thing for this situation. It's the best thing for this individual for the long term. And if they're not making it here, if they're not successful here, then let's set them free to go be successful and do something else. And so it's kind of the only way to think about it. But gosh, we've got acceptance, accountability, we've got authenticity, we've got compassion, we've got empowerment, we've got openness, and we have transparency. So they probably, really all of those words probably factor into a lot of what you've been talking about our history over the last 100 years. But yeah, so interesting. Perhaps we shift gears a little bit to more towards the present moment and talk a little bit about kind of what's been happening maybe for the last 15 or so years up until the present moment. How have things changed? What has been your observation of how the business has evolved over the years? I think for me, one of the things that we have to realize is that if you're not evolving, if you're not changing, then you're dying a slow death. If you're not reinventing yourself and attempting to do something different than you did yesterday, then the guest is going to get bored seeing the same thing over and over in your stores. And somebody else is going to come along and do it better than you're doing it. Somebody with a bigger, deeper pocket, some national retailer, some other player. And so for a company like Bealls, who's always kind of been an underdog, for lack of a better word, I mean, we haven't been the biggest retailer in America. Reinvention and being open to change has always been one of our key strategies and one of the key things that has made us successful. I know ER talked about that a pretty good amount, but what are your thoughts on that and how that's helped us throughout the years, and perhaps potentially how it's been able to help us recently?
Well, I think the company has changed in a number of ways. Probably what hasn't changed are the values that are being restated and repurposed in the context of who we are and who we want to be. But the company has gone, the first billion took 100 years to get to. We're at the second billion in a relatively short time. So the manner in which we do distribution, the logistics have totally changed. The IT, the evolution of IT from the George Hiskus years to what we're utilizing today is unbelievable. For myself personally, I used to walk into Bealls, and I bet I knew 50% of the people that worked within the company. Today, with 15,000 people, you can only know a fraction of the folks that are here. But the ability to react to the modern world and how you've reacted to it is, I think about all the retailers that used to be around in the last 15 years that were bigger, stronger, more well-known, that have no longer exist because they weren't able to adjust to the customer. They weren't able to evolve with the reality of the market, and they overborrowed and they underperformed. So we may be more conservative than most companies. We may borrow less than most companies, but we're able to sustain our operations and attract employees and key executives at the highest caliber because they like a company with the stability that goes with over 100 years of existence. They like a family with a strong board of directors that provides oversight to the company. They like working for a family that is stable, that supports management and supports the board. All of that works together, and it has to work on a multiplicity of levels. Matt, it's as much as I think I understand, every time I peel the onion back, there's 50 other things I find I don't have a clue about. How you operate in retailing today is significantly different than 20 years ago. And I've been privileged to be able to watch this evolve and grow. The family, the Bealls family and Szymanski families, they're continuing to grow. It's important that they continue to be educated as to what the company is, what its values are, its history. And your dad and now you are taking leadership in helping the family understand what's going on. Your elevation of talent within the company. 20 years ago, we weren't as good at doing that. We didn't have the pathways that we have today. But being close to a $2 billion a year company, there are many more pathways and opportunities for executives to evolve, elevate, and to enhance and bring value to the company.
Yeah. Yeah, great. Good answer. Yeah, appreciate it. I think the other thing maybe that you didn't mention was just that being a private company probably has some advantages as well over being a public company, and just you mentioned all the people that have gone out of business in the last 15 years. But if you think about it, it goes way back farther than that. I mean, people, the last 108 years is very, very rare in America and certainly in retail. And so, I think a part of that is the public company dilemma. And on the private company side, a lot of times you do have issues as well. You've got family conflict. You've got family members who are, decide that they want to sell out and that they don't want to be in this crazy business anymore. But on the public side of things, it can be difficult because you're trying to please Wall Street on a quarterly basis. You're not necessarily taking a long-term approach to what the business is going to look like and what's going to make the business successful. A lot of times, you're having to, people are hired guns at that point. You don't have that stability of management or leadership that you might have at a family business with a family leader who's been there and who kind of understands the culture and who understands how things have been and ways to guide it. So you have people rotating in and out of the business with different strategies, and the consumer can sometimes never really catch up to all of those strategies and understand what it is that the company's trying to put forward. So I think for all of those reasons, but especially when you think about people at public companies really wanting to please Wall Street and make decisions for the short term as opposed to the long term, I think that's a huge part of the reason why businesses fail in America today. And for us to be a private company, people ask me if we're ever going to go public, and I say, not a chance, not in my lifetime. I'm sure, that'll be quoted, and I'm happy that it will be, because there is just no intention on our end to ever become public. There's too much. You lose a huge part of your competitive advantage. So yeah, I think that's a part of our success for sure.
Companies that have gone bankrupt and will continue to go bankrupt um, are often victims of being trapped in their own success. They're afraid to take chances. They're unwilling to break their business model because the analyst will punish them, and they end up being led by third parties that don't understand the business, don't understand the markets, and they end up losing.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And you've been a part of this crazy journey for a while. So, it's, a part of it is also, of course, just what sector of retail you're in, what type of a business model that you have. Certainly the off-price model has been working really, really well for really probably since the Great Recession. I mean, before that, certainly. But as people started to trade down after the Great Recession in 07, 08, they started to trade down into the off-price arena, and that really hurt department stores and that kind of a business. And so it does become critical to keep your business updated and to keep things fresh and changing, and hence our change from Bealls department stores to Bealls stores to now Bealls Florida. We kind of dropped the department stores, but now really embracing Bealls Florida. We're a 68 store chain that exists only within the state of Florida, and we're really moving away from that promotional high-low sale model where you have to be in a club to understand, when you need to, when's a good time to shop, and when you don't want to shop. So I think that evolution can help keep a business safe and viable and healthy. But there's times where there's just nothing you can do at the same time. There's been great businesses where something has changed, technology has changed, consumer behavior has changed, and gosh, there's countless examples of that. But take Blockbuster Video, for example. Talk about it was a great company expanding rapidly, and then all of a sudden, there's just no need for movie rentals anymore. So that business is gone. So yeah, it can happen. It does happen, but I think staying nimble and keeping an eye on the future and understanding how technology and consumer behavior is changing is really the key to sustaining a successful and prosperous growing business. So Cliff, in your years with the board, then this has been a partly independent board and a partly non-independent board, and that's kind of an interesting dynamic when you think about a family business, where you've got family members on the board and you've got non-family members on the board. And so when the board now, of course, we're primarily an independent board with just 3 family members on it. I'm the chairman, and then we have Mark and Conrad Szymanski. And aside from that, it's essentially an independent board composed of 12 members. Now, back when we first started the board, what was it like? What was it like when we first kicked things off and the board was launched? Because it wasn't primarily independent at that point, and so all of a sudden you've got my grandfather and my dad was more of a proponent of adding a board, and my grandfather was maybe a little bit more resistant to it. Why do I want these people from the outside coming in and telling me what to do? What was the dynamic like at that point in time, and how has it evolved?
Well, it was evolutionary. And when we started, it was Bob basically sharing what was going on with the company with Betty and Harold Whitcomb and myself. And we would ask questions. We were learning. And Bob was learning. How do you run a board meeting? What should be presented at a board meeting? How do we conduct those meetings? And as we became comfortable, we had a format that worked. Bob, I'm sure, I don't know specifically it worked this way, but I think Bob went to his dad and said, I'd like to bring in 2 people I've met through YPO that I think are excellent thinkers and would add value to the board. And at that point, Harold Whitcomb had left. So Jack Painter and Steve Westerfield joined the board.
And YPO is Young Presidents Organization,
which are up and coming young people that are outstanding achievers. So Jack and Steve joined the board, and I think Bob found the interconnection invigorating. Mm-hmm. Egbert at least tolerated it. And we found that the senior executives liked the comfort of knowing that there was a real board in place. If something happened to Bob, there would be a board that could step in and calm things down, that understood how the company operated and could help appoint the replacement. It helped banks when they're doing their write-ups on whether to lend you money, to know that we had an independent board now in place that could respond. And so, again, initially that was 5 or 6 or 7 members. And over the years, it's grown as the responsibilities of the board have grown. And as businesses become more complex, and as the skill sets needed to function properly as a board became more involved. I think family members, particularly those that aren't as close to the business, take comfort knowing they're electing board members whose responsibility is to them, and to make sure the company is being run appropriately.
Right. Yeah. So that they know that the CEO isn't just doing whatever the CEO wants to do, and that there's oversight. Yeah, that's critical for sure. That's one of the reasons why the board for me has always been, it's always been a great thing to have in the company. And I couldn't imagine not having a board. I enjoy it as the CEO and chairman just because it's a good group of people. It's a smart group of people. They're well connected. They're intelligent. It's a good group of people to be able to bounce ideas off of. And if I want to do something crazy or, make some big change to the company, I can at least run it by the board first. And so what would you say your biggest kind of contribution to family or board has been?
Well, Bob originally told me that he wanted me to be, this is not his words, but a man for all seasons, that I needed to be loyal to the company. And that meant I had to be loyal to all the shareholders. And your father, I think I can share this. He empowered me to call him out if I felt he was impaired in some way, that he wasn't properly functioning, or that he was misguided. He said I had a duty to him to do that. And
cognitively impaired, I guess, for people that don't know, he's been suffering from Alzheimer's for about the last 8 or 10 years. So is it more recent?
That was the culmination of that.
Okay.
It worried him that he might get into a position where he was making decisions that people, because they worked for him or they loved him, would be afraid to hold him up. Fortunately, I was never put in the position, but I knew I was going to have to be the one, if it ever came to that, to draw a line that he needed to step back. But that was how remarkable your father is, that he was doing that for me. But I've worked hard, hopefully successfully, to make sure all of my engagement with family members are authentic, that they hear what I really believe, and that I am doing what I think is in the best interest of them relative to the company. Now, I'm not the right person to say if they want to challenge the company or undermine the company, they better find someone else to talk to, because that isn't the role I'm playing or would try to play. I would like to think that I am one of many guardrails that your father created with Egbert's leadership to help sustain family values, to set the company up to be successful. Because, Matt, for you to lead the company and the family that's associated with it, and by family, I mean employees, stakeholders such as vendors and partners, takes considerable effort. And if those that are behind you, the family and the shareholders, aren't there to support you, it makes your life so much more difficult to achieve that. So part of my loyalty comes from the fact that you all continue to demonstrate that interfamily loyalty to each other, that even sometimes you all have disagreements that are manifest, but you handle them in an appropriate manner. You're civil in your conversations, and you worry about it, and you'll go back and revisit it with someone if you feel like I may have gotten my way, but I'm not happy about it. So you're a great example for how to do things right, but you can't take it for example. So you ask, what is I think one of the biggest things I did for the company, and I will say I was reluctant when the existing right of first refusal agreement had outlived its youthfulness, probably 15 years ago or so. It was necessary because of the complexity of tax, estate planning, and the growth of the family to create a new agreement that everyone would work from. And the company hired a law firm out of state that was an expert in doing this. I think it was like 2 years later, a lot of money was expended and no one was happy. I mean, no one was happy. They didn't like where we had been. They didn't like the journey. So they hired a Florida firm to do it. After 6 months of that or so, no one was happy. It was becoming less and less pleasant. And certain family members had hired other attorneys to start looking at stuff because it was just uncomfortable. So I was asked, I'm sitting here watching all this. They said, well, Cliff, you know the family better than anybody. Would you lead the dialogue? Would you put together the arrangement that we can all live with? And my fear was I wouldn't be any more successful than all those smarter than the rest of us attorneys that had been engaged. But I was able to sit down with my team at the office and work with everyone. And I believe the family came to a wonderful resolution on all the difficult points that had been discussed that everyone was exhausted with. And it's an agreement. It has limitations, but I'm very proud of the family for doing it. The real beneficiaries of that is going to be generation 5 and 6 and maybe 7, because that is what sustains the company, is shared values, trustworthiness, and being able to work through difficulties. So I would like to think that this journey that I've been on with the family, it's not over, I hope. Hope I have opportunity to continue to support the family, but I'm proud to have been, not of myself, I'm proud of the family for coming together, and I was able to be part of that.
Great. Yeah, fantastic. Well, we appreciate you. We appreciate everything that you've done for the company over your 40-year career. You were recently inducted into the Bealls Hall of Fame, so congratulations on
Thank
that.
you.
That's a big accomplishment. Just a few inductees. We've just started that for the audience. We just started that in this past year, and so there's just been, I don't know, a dozen people, I guess, now that have been inducted. So the only prerequisite is you have to be retired before you come in onto the Hall of Fame. And Cliff, you just about a year ago resigned as a voting director, but of course we still have you on as a director emeritus, because I don't know what I would do without your knowledge and your wisdom and what you provide at the board meetings. So
thank you, Matt. And I would add to this, I really wish your great-grandfather and your grandfather and even your dad today could be sitting in here with us, because I think they would be extraordinarily pleased to see your leadership during the past 4 years or so as CEO, during one of the most difficult times this country has seen with COVID and the bankruptcies and the challenges in retail. To be able to come through with a company that is stronger, that is performing at such a high level, is truly remarkable. It's based off of the legacy I think they have passed down through the years, and you are reflective of that, but you're also making your own way, using your own talents, and it is a pleasure to be part of that journey with you even today.
Awesome. Thanks, Cliff. Appreciate those kind words. Appreciate the support. And with that, we'll wrap it up.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, good stuff, man.
Thank you, Matt. Well, I hope you can use some of that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll use most of that.